You're listening to the audiobook for Elvis and the Beatles, Love and Rivalry Between the Two Biggest Acts of the 20th Century, by Trina Young. Copyright 2018. All rights reserved. Introduction. Quote, Elvis is the greatest cultural force in the 20th century. He introduced the beat to everything: music, language, clothes. It's a whole new social revolution. The 60s comes from it. Unquote. Leonard Bernstein. Quote, I say in speeches that a plausible mission of artists is to make people appreciate being alive at least a little bit. I am then asked if I know of any artists who pulled that off. I reply, the Beatles did. Unquote. Kurt Vonnegut. What is the connection between Elvis Presley and the Beatles, the two biggest musical phenomena of the 20th century? Is it just that one came before the other, or one influenced the other, or even that one surpassed the other? No, it's much more significant than that. What really connects these two artists is that they had the same musical dream and basically followed the same career path, roughly 8 years apart. The similarities are astonishing. In the 1960s, Elvis told his friend Larry Geller, quote, I don't know why they gave me a diploma. I don't know how I got out of high school. I would sit there, and I'd just be looking out the window. I had no idea what the teacher was saying. I'd be thinking about Tony Curtis and Marlon Brando, and being a star, and singing. My whole life is a dream. I was dreaming. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, John Lennon said, quote, we knew we could make it. We simply wanted to be the biggest. We dreamed of being the British Elvis Presleys, and we believed it. In the 1960s, as the two biggest entertainment acts in the world, it was only natural that Elvis Presley and the Beatles would hold some inherent rivalry towards each other. But they also had mutual respect and appreciation for one another. The Beatles looked up to Presley, not only in admiration, but also as a motivating force to succeed. Elvis was the highest you could go in the music business, and the Beatles wanted to reach the top, and maybe even surpass their musical idol. Elvis hit his career peak in 1956, 8 years before the Beatles. But those 8 years were a lifetime in a sense, enough time to influence John, Paul, George and Ringo to become musicians and to succeed beyond their wildest dreams. In 1964, the Beatles hit their career peak in terms of popularity and were immediately compared to their idol, Elvis Presley. During the Beatles' first visit to the US in February 1964, they were asked, what do you think of the comment that you're nothing but a bunch of British Elvis Presleys? Although the Beatles laughed off the question by mimicking some Elvis dance moves, the statement was a lot closer to the truth than anyone could have imagined. The Beatles and Elvis were similar in so many ways, which seems to get overlooked in the annals of history. For example, they both popularized rock and roll by integrating American music from the black and white cultures. They both covered songs of all genres, ranging from country to pop to R&B. Their clothes and hair played a huge role in their image and phenomena. They both launched into megastardom after appearances on The Ed Sullivan Show. They both had managers who played a huge role in their success. They both endured public backlash and attacks. They both changed and grew as artists. Within a relatively short period of time, and most importantly, they both went through many of the same experiences personally and professionally. However, even to this day, almost 50 years since the Beatles disbanded and over 40 years since Elvis Presley died, the two musical icons are considered vastly different. Elvis was a solo act, the Beatles were a band. Elvis did not write songs, the Beatles made their mark as songwriters. Elvis was known for lavish stage performances, the Beatles gave up touring, and the list goes on and on. To add to the gap, the Beatles tried to distance themselves from Elvis in various interviews over the years. As early as 1963, the Beatles were dissing Presley in public. On December 7, 1963, the Beatles were guest panelists for the BBC show Jukebox Jury, where they would rate the latest records as a hit or miss. When Elvis Presley's song, Kiss Me Quick, was played, the Beatles did not hold back on expressing their disapproval of the song. Paul, quote, the only thing I don't like about Elvis. I know this is an old track off his Potluck LP, but the thing I don't like about him now is the songs. I love his voice. I used to love all the records like Blue Suede Shoes and Heartbreak Hotel, lovely. But I don't like the songs now. And Kiss Me Quick, it sounds like Blackpool on a sunny day. Audience laughter, followed by applause. Ringo, quote, I didn't like it at all, no. The last 2 years, he's going down the nick. Audience laughter. George, quote, I must admit I didn't like it very much. Not at all. It's an old track. And I think, seeing as they're releasing old stuff, if they'd release something like My Baby Left Me, it'd be a #1. Because Elvis is definitely still there, still popular, it's just the songs, you know, a lot of rubbish. I mean, Elvis is great. The songs are not for me. John, quote, well, I think it'll be a hit because it's Elvis, like people said that about ours. But I don't think it'll be very big. Comically, I'd like those hats, though, with Kiss Me Quick on it. In spite of the negative remarks, the Beatles unanimously voted the song to be a hit. Luckily for the Beatles, Elvis did not have access to see British television in the States. A year and a half later, Presley agreed to meet with the Beatles during their visit to California. The legendary meeting was a career and personal highlight for the Beatles and a wake-up call of sorts for Elvis. After that meeting, there were many positive ways that the Beatles and Elvis connected personally and professionally, and at the very least, had empathy for each other. However, on the surface, it looked like the Beatles and Elvis couldn't be farther apart. The clash of their two worlds came to a head and the Beatles were due to play a concert in Memphis in August 1966. There in Presley's hometown, the Beatles were being physically threatened as a result of controversial remarks that John Lennon had made in an interview, quote, we're more popular than Jesus now. As a result, there was a movement in the South to ban and burn Beatles records in defiance of Lennon's statement. The Ku Klux Klan called the statement blasphemy and threatened different ways and tactics to stop the Beatles from performing in Memphis. Even the city of Memphis joined in on the protest. They released an official proclamation stating that the Beatles were not welcome in their city. Not welcome in Memphis? How ironic. While Presley was worshipped in the Beatles' home country of England, the Fab Four were outrightly being rejected by Presley's hometown in the U.S. As John Lennon would later proclaim, quote, without Elvis, there would be no Beatles, unquote. And Memphis was where it all started for Elvis, ground zero for how and why the Beatles became musicians in the first place. Fortunately, the Beatles' Memphis concerts went on as scheduled with no major incidents. But the fervor and anxiety from the whole incident was reminiscent of how much backlash Elvis had gotten a decade before as the leader of this new, devil's music, called rock and roll. If anyone could understand what the Beatles were going through that night in August 1966, it was Elvis Presley. Elvis and the Beatles, love and rivalry between the two biggest acts of the 20th century, takes a look back at the year-to-year evolution of the careers of both the king of rock and roll and the Fab Four simultaneously while debunking false stereotypes. The book uncovers how surprisingly similar the careers of Elvis and the Beatles were, and the multitude of ways that their personal and professional lives intersected. An attempt to answer the question, who was bigger, is also addressed. By comparing and contrasting the parallel lives, careers and tragedies of Elvis Presley and the Beatles, this book explores like never before the surprising relationship between the two biggest superstars of the last century. Trina Young.